is Terry Wallace, and we're here at the Gardiner Mill Cottage Gallery. And this is the earliest property in East Hampton. It was settled by Lion Gardiner in 1653, had its first home here. And this property was actually inhabited by the British during the American Revolution. Back in 2015, the town of East Hampton acquired this property with the use of community preservation funds. And after we restored the building, it was made into a place to exhibit particularly landscape paintings. And we have run this as a small museum with a focus on a permanent collection, paintings from 1870 to 1900. And in the other part of the museum, we have recurring exhibitions, local artists, local art groups, things that interest us, but things that relate to the local area, which is extremely important because there are not that many places where artists in the East End can really exhibit their work. So we're very conscious of that. We're always looking for new ideas, for ways we can help the art community. Okay. This is an example of what we have over here at the Gardiner Mill Cottage Gallery. On this side we have this group of landscape paintings. We'll start with this one here, which is called The Story of the Sea by Alfred Wordsworth Thompson. And this was painted in 1876, and it's in Montauk at Ditch Plains, okay? We can see here as a group of people get together. Probably the lighthouse keeper's wife is in the middle here with a group of children. She's probably teaching school. What we see in this picture is a shipwreck. And a shipwreck, the ship was towed there, and it actually never left there. So, you know, there are two stories here. The story of there were three houses on Montauk at that time. The story of the people who actually lived there, and also the story of the shipwreck. And so, this Alfred Wordsworth Thompson, who was a member of the National Academy of Design, he also started his career as an illustrator for Harper's during the Civil War. He leaves us with us so that we know what happened really out there in Montauk at that time. We're looking today at a painting by Hamilton. Quite an unusual name, Hamilton. I don't know what his parents had in mind when he named him that. But anyway, what I like about this painting, and what I think it's so important in our history out here, is that we had a lot of oxen out here. A lot of people don't realize that how much the East Hampton landscape was like Europe. In fact, many of the artists, what they did is they studied in Europe. When they came back to America, they heard that East Hampton was a lot like the French Barbizon, and so they called it the American Barbizon. They traveled here because they saw the windmills, they saw thatched cottages, they saw the pastures, they saw things that they saw in Europe, and so it reminded them very much of being on the other side of the Atlantic. One of the artists that came here was named Hamilton, as I mentioned earlier. And in this painting, what he does is he illustrates a man with two oxen, which was a common sight along both the ocean beach and also on the harbor side. And what he was doing is they would collect sea kelp, and they would collect seaweed. And they would use it for insulation in the houses. You know, when we first got this house, and this house was being renovated, we had a lot of dust from this stuff in the house because it acted as an insulation. And the reason that they use it as insulation is that insects and bugs did not bother it. They left it alone. So these guys would come along the beach, they would collect, sea kelp, collect the seaweed, and then what they would do is they would sell it to local contractors. They'd use it in their own houses, and they would have some kind of insulation. But we have a really great perspective on this painting. The way he's coming off this dune is a very, very hard composition for an artist. We're looking at a painting here by Cruiseman Van Elton. Cruiseman Van Elton was born in the Netherlands. And what's unusual about this painting is that it lends itself to kind of a European aesthetic or Baroque aesthetic, something that Van Elton would have learned when he studied back in his native homeland. And the importance of this painting is not just in the style it's painted in, but is also in the fact that this is what the center of town looked like in the 1870s. And we can see here in the composition the oxen, which were very prevalent in that area. We had quite a few of them because they were easy to walk on the beaches or on the sands. And don't forget, a lot of this ground had a sandy texture to it. In any event, where I'm standing now is about where the railroad trestle is today over North Main Street. And this waterway here, which is still apparent if we go over near the IGA and along North Main Street where the trestle is, we see the waterway, and it comes, there are a few places where you could walk over it, where there are like covers to it, but little walkways. This water actually comes from Hook Pond, which comes from the ocean, of course, and that water goes all the way down 3 Mile Harbor Road. It crosses over to Soakhides Road, where the farm is, where Soakhides Road is, where they used to use the drain to make leather goods. Okay. We look at the light in this painting. We can see that there were some trees here, but it was pretty open pasture land. And so we're going to take a look at the painting of down the farm, Soakhides Road, that goes with this in just a second. And the reason they call it Soakhides Road is they would take the hides, and they would put them in the water there that came from Hook Pond, and put them in a drain. Then they would put them on top of the farm to dry the hides out, then make them soft so they could make leather goods out of them. Walter Clark started as a sculptor, went to the National Academy of Design, shared a studio with George Innes, who was at that time the most famous landscape painter in America. He eventually went on to become president of the National Academy of Design. But he rendered this painting I believe he rendered it for posterity, because this is actually a very important place, especially the leather makers in East Hampton, because this is where the leather goods were taken down to the drain. And when we see a drain, it's just a small waterway. Now, earlier we talked about this painting by Cruiseman Van Elton of the center of the village. We talked about the water coming down from Hook Pond, went along 3 Mile Harbor Road, over towards Springy Banks Road, and eventually ended up over here at the farm, which was behind Daymark's Deli today. And the reason it's called Soakhides Road is that they would take the hides, they would soak them in the drain, then they would put them on top of the farm so that they could dry them out and they could cut them up and use them for leather goods. Many people think that the water from Soakhides Road comes from 3 Mile Harbor, but it actually comes from the ocean. It comes from Hook Pond, just goes down along 3 Mile Harbor Road, as I said, Springy Banks. And if we go back in the woods back there, we can still find the foundation for this farm. I've seen it a couple times. And it was really important in that you could see the lack of habitancy. There's almost nobody lived over there at that time. There were a few boats and that's it. So I think it's a great painting by Clark. And I think what he's illustrating here is that, maybe that this is going to be a disappearing thing in the future. Maybe this is a different technology it's going to be missing us, but in any event, I think it's one of the most important paintings of East Hampton. And when I sold the 25 paintings to start this museum, this was certainly one of my favorites because I felt that it really showed East Hampton the way it used to be. This is an important painting of Montauk, Long Island. The title of it is we call it Sand Dunes and Stone Boundary Wall at Montauk, circa 1876. When this painting was brought to me in my art gallery, what I noticed on the back, it had the old Montauk spelling, M-O-N-T-A-U-C-K. And I looked at the painting, turned it around, I looked at the painting, the face of it, and I thought, it must have some kind of a meaning. And I looked down at the name, and it was signed William Sartain, W. Sartain. William Sartain was a good friend of the Moran family, particularly Peter Moran, who he taught at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, and also Thomas Moran. And so I believe that this painting probably originated with Thomas Moran. Sartain probably came out to see the East End of Long Island. He hadn't been here before, and he went out to Montauk and spent some time out there with them. In any event, when we look at the picture, initially I tried to figure out what it was, and after doing a lot of research, I found that in 1820, the trustees were already concerned about the runoff from sheep and cattle into Fort Pond, which provided drinking water for people in Montauk, even though there wasn't that many people there. And so I brought this picture to Robert Hefner, and Robert and I looked at the picture, and Robert did some more research, and we found that there's actually two walls that were behind second house in Montauk. Second house would be in the foreground, about where I'm standing. And then this wall was erected to keep out the cattle. This wall was erected to keep out the sheep. And the main reason was they felt that there was already a problem environmentally with the sheep and with the cattle going into Fort Pond and for ruining and drinking water there. This painting, this small watercolor, is among my favorites in the collection for a few reasons. First, we didn't have a lot of watercolors here. And this particular work is by James Crawford Thom. He was born in 1835. He died in 1898. And he was a son of a very, very well-known sculptor who had achieved a tremendous notoriety during his lifetime. But J.C. Thom, as we call him, became a very adept, a watercolor painter and a oil painter. And this particular painting is important in that it's identified right on the face of the painting. And here it says, East Money Pond, Montauk Point, August '84. East Money Pond is where they believe Captain Kidd dropped his treasure. There were chests of gold in this area. People have looked, they've never found any pirate treasure there. But what's so fascinating about this picture is that in 1884, there must have been a lot of talk about Captain Kidd. And so Thom went out and he painted this picture. The other notable thing about this particular work, and about several other works, 4 or 5 other works that we have in this collection, is that they were donated by my friend Alec Baldwin, who was so generous in helping us here at the Gardiner Mill Cottage Gallery. And Alec Baldwin has always been a friend to the arts. He's donated numerous times to the library, to Guildhall. We did a lot of fundraisers together, and I think that it's only proper for me to thank him for helping myself, helping the village of East Hampton and the town of East Hampton in making this small museum a place that is a real jewel in the town we live in. This particular painting is by William Crothers Fittler, who is an American tonalist painter. And the great thing about it is it illustrates the simplicity of life here on the east end of Long Island. This is the way it looked. A few small farms, people on a leisure day fishing in the creeks that, these little estuaries that came all the way up to town. And it showed why everybody in America, as they learned about the east end of Long Island, they thought, it was such a great thing. This painting is also notable because, not only because it's a great example of this artist's work, but it's among the 25 paintings that the Gardiner Foundation and Catherine Curran was so generous in purchasing from the East Hampton Historical Society and making it part of our museum here. And I don't think we should forget that. That's as important as the painting itself. We're looking at two beach scenes out here in East Hampton, which I would say are two important paintings in that this one here is Main Beach. This is Indian Wells Beach in Amagansett. They were both rendered within a close amount of time, within 10 years, but they were both rendered in the 1870s. So pretty much Main Beach at that time had much higher dunes, as you can see, but it also had a lot of these little beach houses. And there's still one that's over at Thomas Moran's house today that you could see. But in any event, we look here, we see typical vines over to give us some shade, horses on the beach, a few people. And this particular picture, we believe, was a study for a much larger work by John Ferguson Weir. Weir was a teacher at West Point, and he was the father of a well-known impressionist, J. Alden Weir, who was one of the original American Impressionists. In contrast, this particular painting is of Indian Wells Beach. While in the one picture we see more of a leisure setting, we actually see what beaches were used for at that time. Now, after the Civil War was a whole different idea of living in our country. The Civil War was a terrible thing in that it pitted our country against one another. And so by the 1870s, things started to change. Recreation started to become important. Leisure at the beach, leisure activities, housing, second houses, summer colonies, this all occurred at that time. Well, if we look at this particular painting by Edward Lamson Henry, who was a very well-known American painter at the time, and also the founder of the Cragsmore Art Colony, we see the shipwreck, the remnants of the shipwreck Catherine, which went aground in 1851. And on the ship that day were 300 Irish immigrants. Many of those immigrants stayed in East Hampton, and some of them, the descendants of them, still live in town today. But we also see the life-saving service, which predated the Coast Guard. And up along the beach, we look closely here, it's very hard to see, but we'll see the life-saving station, the early life-saving station. And all along the beach we had, because of the amount of the amount of shipwrecks we had these life-saving stations. And we had men that would go out in boats, and we would help these guys when they got shipwrecked. Of course, we can't leave out the fact that on this beach we have a lone couple with a dog, with a parasol. And this pretty much tells us that life was going to really change from this point on. And then from the 1880s, it did change. A lot more people came to the East End. But this is a great example of what it looked like here in the 1870s. When I first came to the Gardiner Mill Cottage Gallery in 2020, we had very few people coming here. So I decided I would turn it into an exhibition space feature local artists, art groups, art movements, things like that. My current exhibition is Peconic Bay Impressionism. It's an art movement that's very close to my heart. And it features a group of painters who were born and bred on the East End of Long Island, particularly in Montauk. They were all related to one another through blood or marriage, and they were all a local product, all the old local Long Island names: Wickham, Moore, Hawkins, Howard, Horton, Basseria, Bell, Hartranft, all Kalin, all the names that we know from Eastern Long Island. It's the founding families of East Hampton. They formed an art group in the 1890s, and they traveled all along the Northeast, and they painted together. Plein air painters. Okay, so in this particular exhibition, which was a 6-week exhibition, we showcased the work of these painters. Now, these painters also exhibited in the first exhibitions at Guildhall and at the Parish Art Museum. And they rented a house on the corner of 114 and Main Street. And so they're quite familiar with this side of Long Island. The Peconic Bay Impressionists, as I mentioned earlier, they're a group of artists who are plein air artists. They were founded by 2 women. Caroline M. Bell was born in 1874 and she died in 1970. And Julia Miller Wickham. These were 2 early families of Montauk. And they were students at the Art Students League in New York, and also the Art Students League up in Woodstock, New York. Initially, they were trained by an artist by the name of Burge Harrison. He was an American totalist painter. He painted like the early painters in our permanent collection. The paintings were dark, and their paintings were often tonalist in nature. And when I say tonalist in nature, muddy browns, blacks, a lot of brooding skies. And they initially painted this way. Burge Harrison enlisted a young man as his assistant by the name of John Carlson. John Carlson wanted to break away from traditional landscape painting. He believed that the paintings he was taught, they were formula paintings. They were made in a studio. He believed that it was more important to take the paintings outside and capture atmospheric effects, cloud studies, shadows, study of light, things like that. And so Caroline Bell and Julia Wickham took his advice. They became plein air painters. Automatically, their palettes brightened. They started to paint out of doors. They came back to East Hampton and Montauk, and they started enlisting other painters. So from 1890 to 1920, they had 8 women, and they painted together. They painted out of doors, mainly under the studies of Caroline Bell. Now, these were women who were quite unusual in that they were extremely independent. Caroline Bell's father was Jackson Wood Bell. He was an important American photographer. She was brought up in an artistic household. And her father's job with his brothers, they worked in Washington, D.C. Their job was to catalog the American Indian. What they would do is they would photograph the American Indian and bring them out from out west, bring them to Washington, take their pictures, and they would say to them, if we have any trouble, we know what you look like. We're going to come and get you. So this is a way that our government tried to keep things calm out west while we were moving westward with exploration. Caroline Bell and these girls made 2 trips to Alaska in the 19-teens, in 1916 and 1917. It was very, very difficult to get to Alaska. There was no Panama Canal, don't forget. And for them to get to Alaska, they had to spend a great deal of time. It was much easier to go to Europe, where of course they all went to Europe and they painted in Europe. You got on a ship, you got off in Southampton, England, And, then you found your way around Europe. In any event, the women stayed as a group from 1890 to 1920. They only allowed women to join. So in the next 40 years, there was 8 women. They painted, they traveled, and they were extremely independent.